In October 1899, war broke out in South Africa between the British and the Boers, descendants of Dutch colonials who lived in two republics of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. The conflict was the culmination of years of tension between the British and the Boers, as well as new settlers in the area largely brought in by the discovery of diamonds and gold deposits in the region, and unresolved issues regarding British interests in the area following their defeat in the First Boer War in 1881. The British asked the Canadian government to send military support as part of the campaign, something that Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier was hesitant to do. However, strong pro-British feelings in the Dominion meant that there was a powerful public support for the mother country. While British loyalty and imperial sentiment ran strong through much of Canada, there was no shortage of dissent along linguistic and cultural lines. Many French Canadians did not think that Canada should get involved in a British imperial conflict overseas. However, the sentiment wasn't universal, with an Ottawa francophone stating, "French Canadians had no reason to be other than loyal to England. England had dealt fairly with us, and we should be unhesitatingly loyal." And another saying, "Every British subject, whether of French or any other extraction, should be willing to bear the responsibilities of empire." The opportunity for French and English Canadians to serve side by side in military action for the first time as an independent nation actually created a unique opportunity for cultural unity, with the Ottawa Journal noting as troops left by train from the capital to Quebec City, "Descendants of the men who fought with Montcalm and Wolfe marched side by side to play their part in the great South African drama." Canada would engage in an active role in a foreign conflict for the first time in the history of the young nation. Arriving after a long voyage, the Canadian battalion encountered a few minor skirmishes before arriving near Paardeberg Drift on February 18, 1900, where they would engage in their first major battle. On that first day, 18 Canadians were killed, but on February 27th, Canadian troops stealthily made their way towards the Boers by the cover of night and dug trenches near the enemy camp. By morning, the Boers surrendered. The battle had cost 31 Canadian lives. The Boers had lost over 300, with more than 4,000 taken prisoner, nearly 10% of the entire Boer army. By June, the British had taken Pretoria, the Boer capital, and the Canadians were there. It would seem to mark the end of the conflict before the Boers turned to a guerrilla campaign for the remaining years of the war. After their year-long tour of duty was complete, the first Canadian contingent of soldiers returned home. According to the Ottawa Historical Society, they arrived in Halifax on the transport ship Idaho, where the government gave them their pay and a set of new winter clothes. They then boarded a train traveling west across the country, dropping soldiers off as it went. Some men came back with incredible and exotic souvenirs of their time overseas. One had a pet monkey that perched on his shoulder, another a parrot he housed in a box. Captain Rogers of Ottawa had a Spitz dog he got in Cape Town, South Africa. While their ship was stopped in St. Helena on the way back to Canada, another had taken sprigs from the willow trees that grew on the former grave of Napoleon when he had been buried on the island. Troops disembarked and were welcomed home throughout the country. Celebrations were held to honor Canada's victories and its first foreign excursion. D Company returned home to Ottawa, where the veterans were met on Parliament Hill by Governor-General Lord Minto, who read them a letter of thanks from Queen Victoria. Speeches were made by Ottawa's mayor and the Secretary of State. 10,000 citizens of Ottawa gathered to cheer and welcome the men home and see them parade through downtown. An extra loud chorus of congratulatory cheers was given to Private R.R. Thompson, who was awarded a Queen's scarf, one of 8 scarves personally crocheted by Queen Victoria and awarded to soldiers of the Commonwealth for extreme bravery in the South African War. Over 30,000 Ottawa school children donated their allowances for a statue honoring 16 volunteers from the city who had died in the conflict. In total, over 7,000 Canadian soldiers and 12 nurses had volunteered and served in South Africa by the end of the war, and February 27th, the day of the first great Canadian military victory, would be honored and celebrated throughout the country as Paardeberg Day for the first decades of the 20th century. So why did Paardeberg Day fade from the public consciousness over time? Some of it may have started before the Boer War even ended. As it progressed, the increasingly frustrated British military took on a scorched earth policy, razing villages and rounding up civilians in an effort to dissuade the guerrilla actions of the Boers and the populations who were supporting them. This soured public opinion back home in Britain and throughout the Commonwealth, and drew backlash against the military's actions. By the time the British achieved victory in 1902, more than 20,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers had been killed, and more than 40,000 Boer civilians had died, many under horrible conditions. It would be the last great conflict of imperial expansion for the British, with the population at home turning against the idea of foreign excursions and conflicts in far-flung corners of the empire. Then the 1910s were of course mired by the First World War, and devastation and losses on a human scale never before seen. While the commemoration of previous military victories, like Paardeberg, may have been seen as a way to boost morale and national spirit, others thought that it may be inappropriate given the devastating losses many families were experiencing, and so some local observances on February 27th were quietly retired during the conflict. The IODE, or Imperial Order of Daughters of the Empire, decided to halt their celebration of the day in 1917, in deference to the Boers who were now fighting in Europe under the British flag. Additionally, the overall sentiment when commemorating national sacrifice during wars changed during this time, and over the ensuing years. From great celebrations commemorating victories in battle, there was a shift to somber and solemn remembrance of those lost. Local observance of Paardeberg Day was not uncommon into the middle of the 20th century, often attended by veterans of the Boer War. They believed there was important lessons from the conflict that needed to be remembered by future generations. One poignantly observed during a 1938 service just before the start of World War II that, "I can recall that my grandfather was very indignant because the British government loaned money to the Boers to re-establish their country. But when King George V was crowned in 1911, General Louis Botha and General Jan Christian Smuts, two of the Boer leaders, were present. Thus an enemy had been made a friend, and the South Africans fought for the empire in 1914. Great Britain in 1920 wanted to re-establish Germany, but the French were opposed. Their policy was one of revenge. They had Germany down, and they wanted to be sure she would never rise again. The result of that policy is our present situation in Europe. The French policy of revenge dominated Europe for 10 years after the Treaty of Versailles had come into effect in 1920. If the world powers had learned a lesson from the Treaty of Peace with the Boers after the South African War, the Versailles Treaty would have produced different results." End quote. As the years progressed and there were fewer and fewer veterans of the South African War left, services for Paardeberg Day seemed to fade with them. Today we pause and reflect on those who served and those who lost their lives in war on November 11th, Remembrance Day. It has come to serve as the day when we honor the dead from all past and current conflicts. But we also mark dates of special significance throughout the year. For example, we recognize Vimy Ridge Day every April 9th, commemorating perhaps the most defining battle of Canada's military history. While not a holiday, it is a national day of observation and reflection, and maybe February 27th, Paardeberg Day, should be seen that way too.